Anti-communist strategy. In the 1950s, in Italy, there was no talk of the Mafia among the general public. Some people denied the existence of Mafia groups and said that talking about the Mafia reinforced a racist image created by others about Sicilians. But there is a principle that says that when no one talks about the Mafia, it means that the Mafia has power in that area, and thanks to the support of political powers, it does not need to attract attention. During the Cold War, the Sicilian Mafia played a key role in preventing the development of the communist left wing in Italy. There were two main powers in Italian politics. The Christian Democrat Party was at the center of the political spectrum, and on its far left, there was another important bloc consisting mainly of socialists and communists. The Democratic Christian Party always received the most votes, but they never had an absolute majority in parliament. In the successive elections of those years, the share of the Communist Party was constantly increasing, and in case of victory, Italy would join the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union at that time. The Democrats' Christian Party. Historically, they had a significant influence among Sicilians who tended to vote for a traditional political party like the Democratic Christian Party. Therefore, their votes played a crucial role in limiting the electoral victories of the communists. The main reason for the uniformity of votes among Sicilians since the introduction of universal suffrage was the Mafia's power, or at least its influence. The Mafia had such power in electoral battles that it could easily protect its members and their activities. Lover and informant. Tommaso Buscetta was born on July 13, 1928, in a very large and very poor family in Sicily. He was the youngest of 17 children and his father was a glassmaker. Buscetta married at 16 and turned to black market trade during World War II to support his family. At that time, he also fought alongside the Italian resistance against the Germans, and it was during this period that he acquired skills with firearms that caught the attention of the Mafia. At the age of 20, he joined the Mafia, and it is said that his first job was cigarette trafficking. After the war, his economic situation forced him to migrate to Argentina, where he started a glassmaking workshop. However, his business did not thrive, and in 1957, Buscetta decided to return to Palermo in Sicily. He fled again after violent wars within the Mafia in the 1960s, first to Brazil, then to Mexico, and finally to New York. From 1962 to 1972, he was involved in international drug trafficking and built a large business that earned him the nickname, Boss of Two Worlds. He had two other wives besides Vera Girardi, an Italian, and Cristina de Almeida Guimarães, a Brazilian, who both gave him children. His multiple wives and mistresses led to his expulsion from Cosa Nostra. According to his colleagues, adultery was considered a far greater sin than murder. Buscetta was arrested in Brazil in 1972 and extradited to Italy, where he remained in prison until 1980. In the late 1970s, the gang wars in Palermo intensified again, and the Corleone group gained control over Cosa Nostra with a series of brutal killings, targeting government officials who tried to impede their rise to power. Buscetta realized the gravity of the situation and fled again in 1980. In 1983, he was arrested in Brazil, accused of international drug trafficking, and returned to Italy. After a failed attempt at self-destruction, he became the most important informer in Mafia history, a decision that ultimately cost the lives of 39 of his relatives. He never revealed anything about himself and used his position to attack his enemies. He died in 2000 in New York, surrounded by his family and protected by the American government. The impact of America. The Mafia reorganized itself within this anti-communist political scenario. After the Allied victory in World War II, indirect relationships were formed with American society, and a desire for a new way of life emerged among Italians, including the Mafia. The attractions of modern America, mainly stemming from Hollywood films, eventually contributed to the transformation of the Mafia. Prior to that, the Mafia's main business was seizing properties, especially the citrus groves of Conca d'Oro, known as the Golden Valley, which was located around Palermo. However, after Italian Mafia groups became interested in American-style living, their interest in construction and building projects increased significantly. Agricultural reforms. The agricultural reforms of 1950 did not fundamentally change the ownership and distribution of land. The reforms were based on the principle that the government would buy land from large landowners and then sell it to farmers and their families through a lottery system. The Sicilian parliament established a maximum limit of 150 hectares per plot and created a special agency called IRAS to manage and supervise the reforms. However, finding and utilizing these new opportunities was not difficult for large landowners. They kept the best land for themselves, sold the worst land to the government, and pocketed a huge profit. They also transferred their remaining land to their friends or relatives. As a result, the worst land that was insufficient and unsuitable for large families of farmers became their lot. The democratic Christian government designed the agricultural reforms in response to the pressures from left-wing political currents, especially the Communist Party. The reforms were successful politically, as large estates were finally broken up. However, from a social perspective, they were a failure. The goal of giving land to farmers who were being exploited by the Mafia was not achieved. With this failure and the loss of hope among farmers, the only option left for farmers was migration. Migration to cities. During this period, Italy experienced unprecedented economic growth in its cities, and internal migration was the solution to meet the labor demand. The Allies had heavily bombed Palermo during the war, and now the city needed reconstruction. As a result, a growing number of poor peasants, fleeing from rural areas in search of work, poured into the city. At the same time, political currents were working to influence public opinion to prevent the rise of communism. The Mafia, on the other hand, was seeking ways to carry out its activities without trouble. The result was a pact between the Christian Democrats and the Mafia, which led to the looting of many Sicilian cities. Palermo was one of the most striking examples of this phenomenon. It was a place where Mafia collusion with trade and politics led to chaos. The destruction of Palermo and other cities meant, even in its least form, a violation of urban planning regulations. This allowed Mafia-related businesses to profit from obtaining building permits and for illegal groups to benefit from the best construction projects. In just a few years, Palermo, which was once a beautiful city, became polluted and ruined. Salvo Lima, the mayor of Palermo, and Vito Ciancimino, his responsible advisor for public construction projects, who were both Christian Democrats and members of the Mafia, destroyed the city center. They demolished old buildings and villas in Art Nouveau style and built skyscrapers instead. They asphalted the parks and turned the city's outskirts into a concrete jungle. In the short period from the late 1950s to the early 1960s, the city's atmosphere underwent a complete transformation. During these years, the Mafia was more active in Sicilian politics and its influence expanded through a series of contracts and public works projects that went beyond building permits to include road maintenance, sewer systems, and waste collection contracts. Everything was under the control of the emerging bourgeois mafia, which included a new class of lawyers, businessmen, experts, and politicians. These new mafia groups collaborated with armed mafia members. This collaboration meant the destruction of the entire city system. Meeting of mafia leaders. In the 1950s, when the political system had its eyes closed to all these crimes and injustices, the mafia began to reorganize itself. In October 1957, the most important leaders of the American Mafia traveled to Palermo and stayed at the Grand Hotel de Palms for a few days. They hadn't come to Palermo just to visit old friends and family. They had a plan, but it seemed that the Italian government officials weren't aware or informed that their meeting in Palermo marked the beginning of a new and important phase in the development of the Sicilian Mafia. U.S. President Eisenhower commanded one of the two Allied armies stationed in Sicily in June 1943. When those mafia members who were in prison and called themselves anti-fascists were released, they took power from the Allied forces. Now, thanks to the same people, the president was facing a serious drug problem. Every year, an increasing number of American youth, almost all under the age of 21, were dying from heroin addiction, and since this substance was supplied by the American Mafia, the Italian Americans had become the largest enemy of the U.S. government. The youth of the country were disappearing, and this problem had to be solved soon. In 1956, the U.S. Congress passed a law to combat drug trafficking. This law allowed U.S. courts to issue harsh sentences for those who collaborated with drug traffickers. As a result, the American Mafia's direct involvement in heroin supply became extremely dangerous. They needed to find a solution to this problem, a solution that would preserve a part of the massive heroin trade for themselves. The American Mafia decided to give their Sicilian relatives the exclusive right to import drugs into America and, in 1957, they formally agreed on this in Grand Hotel.